Okay, well, I just want to thank everyone for being with us today. My name is Margaret Henn. I'm the Director of Program Management at Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service. And we are here today to talk about how racial and economic disparities impact access to justice for so many of the Marylanders that we help. People of color who are being forced to navigate the harshest impacts of COVID in terms of health and financial devastation are also those who face unequal barriers in navigating the legal system. Today, through our work with a diverse group of community partners, including organizations that have roots in the areas of most unmet need, like Park Heights in Baltimore City and Turner Square in Baltimore County, we're making a concerted effort to break down these inequitable systems that disproportionately impact communities of color and help Marylanders get legal counsel and representation that they need to secure some of their most basic human rights, like housing, employment, and custody of their children. With that said, I'm very excited you're joining our conversation today, and I'm pleased to introduce you to our panelists. Susan Francis is the Executive Director of MVLS, and she's a member of the Baltimore City Council's Commission on Aging and Retirement Education, otherwise known as the CARE Commission, as well as a member of the Maryland Attorney General's COVID-19 Access to Justice Task Force, and a member of Mayor Brandon Scott's Transition Steering Committee. Asia Mallory is MVLS's consumer staff attorney who specializes in helping clients navigate collection matters, landlord-tenant issues, foreclosures, and tax sales to keep families from losing their homes. Nika Namdi, a Baltimore native, is the COO and founder of Fight Blight Baltimore, which is the social, economic, and environmental justice initiative that takes action to fight blight in Baltimore and make housing stable and safe for families in the city. Nika is also a member of Mayor Brandon Scott's Transition Steering Committee. Hutch Robbins is a partner at Miles and Stockbridge and a longtime supporter of civil legal aid, as well as an immediate past president of MVLS's board of directors and an advisory member of our organization. He's also a longtime MVLS volunteer attorney. And we're happy to have Amy Hennon, the Director of Advocacy and Financial Stabilization at MVLS, as our moderator today. Amy leads MVLS's advocacy work and oversees the Housing and Consumer Program at MVLS, as well as our Workforce Development Project, which provides legal services to job trainees, removing barriers to employment for Baltimore's most vulnerable populations. As we get started, I want to ask you to please write any questions that you have in the Q&A section of the Zoom call. Rather than the chat section, please do use the Q&A section because this is what we'll be monitoring. It would be great when you post a question to also share your media affiliation as well if you can. So before I turn it over to Amy, I want to quickly share a video that illustrates one of the legal issues that we work on at MVLS. I think this video will be helpful in framing the conversation that we're going to have today.
Many of my family, the elders, lost their homes, either in foreclosure or they had to sell it to white folks in that area. I really want to reclaim my aunt's home. I have to go through this process of reopening the estate because they did not have a will, to my knowledge. So trying to figure out how do I do this in the most equitable and legal way possible. It makes my soul glow just because I want legacy here. We have more control over our land, our property, and what we want to see happen with it. I think for so long, people in my family, like Black folks, they've always had people doing things to them. And I think it's really great that now we shift that mindset of like, no, I'm taking ownership of this. I have agency. There's a lot of power and healing when it comes to ownership, and that's what I'm hoping to get.
Reach out to Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service to protect your home, your deed, and your legacy.
Okay, so with that, I want to turn the presentation over to Amy, our moderator, to begin our discussion. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Margaret. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I've been working on social justice issues for many years, and I see the experiences of our client population, which consists of Marylanders who are facing financial hardships, those who are living paycheck to paycheck, until a trigger moment happens in their life and they can no longer keep up with house payment, their tax payments, their water bills, and if they're without a steady job. With 68% of our client population being Black, it's evident that race plays a large role in how Marylanders find themselves in contact with the legal system. This conversation is critical. It's so critical today at how we look at how Marylanders are accessing health services and food, and getting access to COVID-19 testing, as well as access to vaccines, as they still try to struggle with their basic needs, housing, employment, and keeping their family together. And these are struggles that are disproportionately borne by our Black and Brown communities. I'm so glad that today we have Susan Francis, as she can provide a historical look at why civil legal aid is in Maryland, where civil legal aid is in Maryland, where we've been and where we're going. So Susan, why is civil legal aid so important for Marylanders?
Thanks, Amy. As in every other state, there is a there's a right to counsel in criminal cases. And so many of us understand that if there's a charge in a criminal matter, that someone's going to get assistance. But in this civil context, there's no right at all. And for the majority of us, where we're actually going to interact with the legal system is in our family life, in our housing or our employment. And when someone is forced to navigate that on their own, their outcomes are dramatically different. And that's why we were created. So 40 years ago this year, a group of ambitious, and I think of them as a little bit crazy, folks came together and said, we have this substantial justice gap. It was at a time in which Congress was defunding legal services, and looked around and said, where else can we get help from? And they looked at private attorneys, government attorneys, in-house counsel, and really said, let's marshal some of that power. And so 40 years ago this year, we were created to do exactly that, to try to address the overwhelming amount of individuals that are trying to navigate that judicial system on their own, a system that was created for attorneys, not for individuals. And so that is why we were created. Like I said, it's been 40 years. We announced earlier this year, in our first 40 years, we have helped over 100,000 Marylanders with their civil legal issues. And just last year, our volunteers donated over $6 million of their attorney time to our services. And so as MVLS has evolved over the years, we also, as we've continued to provide the direct legal services, partnering the individual up with that volunteer for the full life of that case, we've also in the last few years really started to think about legal services, but then legal reforms as well. And where is the system failing in terms of providing for all of Marylanders, and what we're going to talk about today, how race equity and structural racism is really impacting our ability as a legal services provider to ensure that all Marylanders have fair and equal access to the judicial system.
Thank you, Susan. My next question is for Nika and Susan. Recent events across the country have really put a spotlight on racial disparities in the legal system. And much emphasis has been put on the criminal legal system. But what's the role of civil legal services for advancing racial equity in Maryland's civil legal system?
So I would say, just given kind of going behind what Susan said, the reality of it is that most people are going to engage the law in a civil capacity. And so we don't think about often, how things as simple as your tax assessment. And if you choose to challenge it through that process, eventually you can end up at the tax court. But who's there to help folks navigate that process. Even in, in civil court, the language isn't accessible. One of the things that I noticed in looking at issues surrounding estate administration, if I look at the Register of Wills website, some of the language is simply not accessible to people. So they don't understand something as simple, what might be as simple to lawyers as that the house ownership doesn't immediately pass to the heirs at a person's death, just the accessibility. And so if we think about it, many of the vectors for, racial exploitation have come in the civil legal system, whether that was restrictive covenants, whether that in the 1930s through 50s, or whether that in the 1800s was the Maryland Occupational Acts, which prohibited Black people from owning carts and drays and thus developing economically. Or you look forward to today at Medicaid recapture. So what happens when someone living in a home has to go into a facility using Medicaid, and then what happens to their home, right? And the state coming to get that money back. Those are all civil issues in the law that definitely impact, the economics of a community, but it's not something that people would focus on. So I think these are other areas really where you see inequities in civil law.
And if I can follow up on that, I just totally agree with everything Nika just said, but, Amy, you had mentioned that we at least have some understanding, I think, at this point in terms of the criminal side and the disproportionate or disparate impact that's happening on communities of color when it comes to over policing, to over prosecution, to over sentencing, and the impact that it's having in communities. But we're really at the very beginning stages of thinking about this in terms of the civil side. And what we know at MVLS and working with community partners like Nika is the numbers. Nika, I know, is a big proponent of the numbers and using data. And when we look at our clients are disproportionately Black in every area that we provide services in. And that's not a failing of the Black community. That is a failing of our society. And so we're interested in really starting to have this conversation and thinking about how our legal system operates. One of the things is we like to think we have an impartial legal system, and the reality is we don't. So we have, first off, as Nika's pointing out, we have many folks navigating a complicated legal system on their own, and they're not going to have as good of outcomes as if they have an attorney. At the same time, in terms of it not being impartial, the legal system was set up for those that were in power. And so the legal system works really well for some folks. So landlords, for example, or creditors, and I know we're probably going to talk about that a little bit later. So this notion that we're starting with an impartial system is not actually true. It is a fiction. And so thinking about how do we get to an actual impartial system should be part of our conversation. And then secondarily, we think about a fair system, a fair and just system. And if we're going to have a fair and just legal system, we need to have a fair and just society. And we don't have that. And I think, hopefully if nothing else in the last year, we have begun to understand and grapple with, both in terms of the disproportionate impact of COVID, and of course with George Floyd's killing and the trial happening right now, we don't have that society. And so, we want to kind of hold the legal system up to the standard in which it's premised on a fair starting point. And so when Nika's talking about, even with our, the deed work that we do and the video that we saw, we can have what appears in their face to be neutral laws that applies to everybody the same, but of course they don't, because we're not all getting from the same starting point in terms of our places in society. And so when Joelle is talking and having to reopen an estate, there are costs that come with that, and those costs are borne differently by different individuals, and the vast majority of time that weight of bearing is much heavier on communities of color, because you have this history of disinvestment, the economic disinvestment, and even up to the recent the first round of the Paycheck Protection Plan funds, leaving out communities of color, the numerous ways in which housing and wealth building has been denied in communities of color. And so it is this both this system in which already sort of leans towards one power dynamic, and then this notion of we think we have a neutral system, which is in no way actually impacting individuals in a neutral way.
Thank you for that, Susan. What you were saying about bad laws really makes me think a lot about the ways MVLS has been a part of efforts to change the laws in Maryland. We've been involved in a number of advocacy efforts in Annapolis, including things related to debtors' prisons and tax sale. But Hutch, you were involved in one of our advocacy efforts with the court when we were working on issues related to tax sale. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, Amy. So I had the privilege of actually having MVLS as a client. I represented MVLS in connection with a friend of the court brief that MVLS filed in a tax sale case that involved really an abusive practice by a tax sale purchaser and counsel who were, I would say, gaming the notice system. As you can imagine, in tax sales, notice is incredibly important. You have to give notice to the homeowner that they might lose their home to a tax sale. And what we saw going on was really improper notice processes. And so MVLS stepped in and filed a brief with the court on behalf or on the side of the homeowner, trying to point out some of these abusive processes that we saw going on. It's just one way in which we're trying to change the structural well, maybe in this case, it wasn't so much change a lot, it was to protect the structure that's in place to protect homeowners in connection with tax sales. And it's an important effort, to make sure that justice is served for all, something that we care deeply about.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we certainly really appreciated your efforts helping us get that together. Another issue that I want to mention is one that really was a terrible practice plaguing renters that had to do with the statute of limitations, which just meant how long landlords had to be able to file against a former tenant for back rent. And in 2019, there was a Maryland case, Smith v. Wakefield, in the Court of Appeals that sided with the former tenant because in that case, it changed the statute of limitations from 12 years, meaning that landlords had 12 years after somebody moved out to sue them, and is now limited only to 3 years, which is indeed what the practice is for almost every other sort of consumer collection case. And it meant that landlords could no longer wait 5 or 10 years to after a tenant moved out to pursue them. And the struggle with that really is that tenants don't have enough access to counsel, both at the initial stage when a potential eviction occurs, and also at later stages when they're potentially being pursued for back rent. There are a lot of ways that attorneys can truly be impactful at each different stage in preventing some of these sort of large bills, but the fact that landlords were able to wait 11 years before filing really highlighted that discrepancy. This win was a huge win for Marylanders, particularly renters on limited income. And it was MVLS, along with the Holland Law Firm, the Public Justice Center, Maryland Legal Aid, joining forces in helping get this issue before the Court of Appeals and get that win. And so we're hoping to make changes like that in other areas, profound changes like that in other areas of the law too. So I'm going to move to our next question, which focuses on challenges presented by the pandemic. Asia and Hutch, what are some of the most pressing issues that have come to light for Marylanders in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic?
All right, so as a staff attorney, I work directly with clients, and in working with these clients, there is an increasing number of cases that involve older adults. Adults over the age of 60 are increasingly targeted for frauds, scams, and financial exploitation. Right now, the latest challenge for this demographic is unemployment scams. Another pressing issue that we are seeing is foreclosure and what it means for homeowners when the moratoriums are lifted. Once lifted, we expect to see a large number of homeowners seeking legal assistance. But while mortgage forbearance allows homeowners to pause or reduce payments, millions of homeowners are more than 90 days behind on their payments, and they are likely to experience severe financial hardships when regular payments resume and when the moratoriums are lifted. Of these families, we are seeing that Black and Hispanic families are more than twice as likely to report being behind on housing payments. They are at higher risk of losing their homes. Once these moratoriums are lifted, we are likely seeing a large portion of Black and Brown communities at risk of being homeless. Another pressing issue is student loan debt. The student loan debt continues to be a pervasive problem that hinders people from completing milestones or entering professions that they truly enjoy. Collectively, student loan borrowers in the US owe more than $1.7 trillion. Fortunately, federal loans have been stayed until September, allowing the money to be used for other necessities. However, if a student has private student loans, the private student loans have not been stayed. Thus, students have to know when to call their servicers and how to ask for COVID forbearance. When the forbearance is over and payments resume, student loans will likely and continue to exacerbate the racial wealth gap. So those are some of the pressing issues that I've been seeing as a staff attorney at MVLS. Essentially, when I'm working with these clients, I'm already seeing that the recovery for COVID will be in a K-shaped form. Communities of color have a long, hard road to recovery. The higher unemployment rates and the higher debt ratio is just going to be a very long road to recovery for them.
Yeah, and Asia, I come at this from a similar perspective in that I'm a volunteer lawyer for MVLS, and I've been volunteering now for about 20 years with MVLS. And when the pandemic hit, I made a special push among my colleagues at my law firm, as well as all my contacts in the Maryland legal community, to volunteer for MVLS because we could see the kind of havoc that the pandemic was wreaking and knew the legal challenges that people were going to be facing. And one of the things that's apparent to me is that people need jobs to address, some of the debt crises that Asia was referring to. You need to have people employed to get them out of debt and out of poverty. Now, the pandemic, has been devastating, caused a lot of heartache and anxiety throughout society, no doubt. But the financial devastation of COVID-19 has not been borne equally. And I have some really interesting data that I think sort of puts meat on the bones of what Asia was describing. And this is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Now, this is back in the last fall, so approximately November 2020 data, but I think it really highlights what we're talking about here. They reported that 13% of households didn't have enough to eat in the past 7 days. Now, those numbers, that's a concerning number, to put it mildly, but consider the disparity here. 22% of Black households and 21% of Hispanic households didn't have enough food to eat in the past 7 days, as compared to 9% of white households. With respect to rent, 1 in 5 renters owe back rent. And of those struggling to pay that back rent, 14% are white, 26% are Hispanic, and 29% are Black. With respect to basic expenses, 36% of people reported struggling to pay their usual household expenses. with communities of color experiencing the highest need. Black families at 52%, Hispanic families at 50%, white families at 29%. And the unemployment rates back in the fall, of 53% of the jobs that were lost between last February and last November were in the lowest paying industries, which has a disproportionate effect on communities of color. The unemployment rates back in November were of the Black community, 10.3% unemployed, Hispanic 8.4% unemployed, white 5.9% unemployed. So you can see in the data how different this impact has been with respect to these various communities. And again, from where I sit, if people can get employment, they can get back to work, it can really help this looming debt crisis. And what I mean by looming debt crisis, and Asia spoke about this, is so much has been deferred in this pandemic. Foreclosures, evictions, collections lawsuits, in many cases have just been put on hold while the courts dealt with their own pandemic issues. But that they haven't gone away, and that they're going to have to be dealt with. And MVLS is going to face a surge in clients through the spring and the summer and the fall to come. Now, how do we help people get employed as lawyers in the civil legal process? You knock down or you eliminate the barriers to entry for employment. And Amy, I know that you're involved with the workforce development work that MVLS does, and maybe you could speak about that briefly, and I'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the work that I do as a volunteer on knocking down the barriers to entry for employment.
Thanks for bringing that up, Hutch. Workforce development is a really critical component of the work that we do at MVLS. There are sites throughout, especially throughout Baltimore City, but there are sites throughout the state that are helping connect people who have been previously kept out of the job market, out of the traditional economy, either because they are returning citizens or because they are just because of the nature of where they have lived and grown up and everything that's happened to them, and the ways that they have been really kept out of good jobs that pay well. There are these sites that are helping train folks for really good jobs in healthcare, jobs in construction, even green jobs. And we, MVLS provides some wraparound legal services to those folks to remove barriers related to not having a license. So you can't drive to your job if you don't have a license, but there are all kinds of barriers that exist to just being able to get a license in the first place. Barriers that you don't necessarily think of for everybody, but that, if you've got a judgment against you that is really old, that could potentially be a barrier, because when you start, when you're potentially going to be hired by an employer, they might do a credit check on you. They might consider any judgments that are against you about whether or not they want to hire you. And so a lot of the efforts that are put into kind of removing the legal barriers to employment are a huge part of what our workforce development project does. We've actually been involved with the Baltimore Health Corps as well, which so we have a staff attorney who is providing legal services to those folks. And the Health Corps actually released a really great report really recently about their fall statistics. And they have about 85% of the people hired were people who were either underemployed, unemployed, or furloughed when the hiring took place, and about 65% of them were Black, Indigenous people of color. So the program was directly targeted at hiring folks that were really the most impacted by the pandemic. And then we're providing those services to make sure that when they are going to be leaving these jobs at the Health Corps, because these are temporary jobs that relate to either contact tracing or other kind of critical things related right now to the pandemic. When the pandemic is over, these jobs won't necessarily exist anymore, but there are efforts being made to make sure that when they re-enter when they are going into the rest of the workforce, they won't have these barriers that would keep them out of that workforce.
Well, one of the barriers, Amy, that you mentioned, or that you didn't mention, or you may have mentioned, is criminal record. I mean, a lot of people don't realize what a significant problem it is to get a job if you have a criminal record. And one of the things that MVLS can do for its clients is expunge criminal records, which is essentially means just to wipe away those criminal charges that under the law can be expunged. Now, not every criminal charge can be expunged, but there are certain charges that can, and we as volunteers are able to represent folks in the expungement process to get their records clear so they have a better opportunity to get a job. Another thing that you did mention was a driver's license. And I think a lot of people don't realize how hard it can be to get employment if you don't have adequate identification. And that is can be a real bugaboo for folks. I represented a woman who was born in a row house in East Baltimore. And her birth was not documented in any way. She had no birth certificate. She had no hospital record. In the eyes of the government, she simply did not exist. So you can imagine all the things that we take for granted in being able to prove who we are, she could not do. Now, through the legal process, we were able to get her a state identification card, which allows her to do all those things that we simply take for granted. And these are just some of the examples that volunteer attorneys with MVLS do on a regular basis to try to get folks back to work.
All right. Nika, do you have anything that you'd like to share about kind of what is a big issue in the pandemic?
Sure.
Some of the big issues that we're seeing.
So one of the big issues that we're seeing surrounds tax sale. So as Hutch mentioned and others have kind of alluded to, the economic stranglehold that COVID-19 has caused on many folks is disproportionately impacting the Black community, specifically because many of the jobs that folks are doing are in areas that were deemed non-essential and thus closed. And so something like 40 to 50% of Black businesses are projected to close. Many of them were hiring from their own, from our own community. And thus, so you have people who are not able now economically to afford to pay rent, to take care of food, medicine. But also one of the things that comes with that is not being able to pay your property taxes. And so right now there's something like 3,823 documented instances of homeowners being at danger of losing their, of going to tax sale, which could subsequently result in a tax sale foreclosure. And given that we're in the middle of a global health pandemic that requires people to social distance, that means that people need to be housed safely, right? They need to be able to stay in their homes. And what is being predicted as a eviction tsunami and probably a foreclosure tsunami as a result of these economic issues is certainly certainly something that we're concerned with given tax sale and given the numbers of folks who are homeowners that we're seeing in tax sale. And so basically tax sale is the process by which the city has elected, or the state, but the city is in the case of the work that we do, is the collector, goes about collecting unpaid property tax debt. There's, roughly a 2-year-long process, but if someone doesn't have $1,000 to pay their property taxes today, given the fees and interest, they certainly won't have $3,300 12 months from now, which is roughly what $1,000 unpaid tax debt would balloon to. And so, that piece, the monetary piece is one piece, but then there's the understanding of the process, engaging with the attorney, engaging with the city, because at one point there is a 2-step redemption process. So the process itself is complex, it is costly. And so we have major concerns about making sure that, no homeowner loses their house to tax sale. And then there's also issues surrounding, folks, renters who are, maybe have a housing provider that only owns a couple units, and them not being able to pay the taxes because maybe their renters aren't able to pay the taxes. So it really has, tax sale has really devastating impacts on communities, whether you're talking about one family being displaced, which we can't afford when we have such high levels of housing insecurity, but also the number of properties that are vacant and abandoned that cycle through tax sale because their owners have abandoned them. And so we're definitely looking at very carefully at that. We're following that very carefully. We are pushing the city, the mayor, in fact, and the Bureau of Revenue Collections, the director, Henry Raymond, to really reform the system for collection, because in a word, it's predatory, right? And so right now, the SOS fund, which was started by a member of MVLS, myself, and two members of MVLS, and then 2 other advocates, we right now have 15 clients, and we're about, a third of the way through fundraising for those folks. So we have about $21,000 outstanding that we can't cover. We've raised $26,000, which is all fine and good, but the reality of it is we need to be advocating for a collection system that is fair and just, and that is frankly good governance, because instead of the city giving 12 to 18% interest to speculators and investors, the city could be collecting a much smaller amount in a collection fee, right? That could be 1 to 3%, at the max, but that isn't what we're seeing. We just need, at this point, for us to really understand the level of economic pressure that's being applied in communities by tax sales, by evictions, by condemnations. All of these are factors that weigh very heavily. And of course, if you can't get a job because you don't have an ID or because you had a past criminal record, it makes it difficult to make sure that the place that you're living, you're able to pay the property taxes or contribute to the property taxes. So all of these legal, the civil legal pieces and the criminal legal pieces all go together to create a system that is really devastating to the Black community.
And Nika, if I could add to that, because I think, tax sales, one of those perfect areas that it really does seem neutral on its face. It seems pretty simple. You don't pay your property tax, you could lose your house. And that seems like a thing that's just sort of, just is a neutral thing. But it's not. That's it's not. And so, the first call I took from a client that was in tax sale was in 2013. And I thought it was a mortgage foreclosure. And then I thought she was confused because her house was paid for. So how could she be losing it? And then I found out about the tragedy of tax sale. But my immediate thought is we can't ever separate this Black homeowner in Baltimore City who was at risk of tax sale from the history, right? The disinvestment, the housing destabilization, the creating the tremendous wealth gap, and not having all the barriers to wealth building in the communities of color. And so you take something that looks very neutral on its face, and then you start seeing who's actually being affected by it. So Nika certainly sees this in the work that she does and the work that we do at MVLS. 85% of our clients who are at risk of tax sale are Black, which is of course a profound disproportionate representation. And so, as Nika said, one of the things we've been trying to encourage the mayor to do is can't get owner occupieds out of tax sale for this year because of COVID. Also, Mayor Scott has been very forward thinking and having an equity platform and helping him understand that tax sale and yet again destabilizing particularly Black homeowners in Baltimore City is an equity issue, but also really encouraging all of us to think differently about our legal system. Again, I started talking about an impartial system and a fair system, and an impartial system, we don't have that right now. This tax sale leans towards and gives credit and power to tax sale certificate holders and the city, and takes away power from homeowners who are both experiencing all these financial challenges, but as Nika said, even the policy and the practices, and it doesn't have to be this way. If we want an impartial system and a fair system, there are other ways that we can do this. So Nika had mentioned we're encouraging the city to think about a different model, and a model that still says you pay your property taxes. We're not encouraging, we're not saying folks shouldn't pay their property taxes, but we're saying, what if we had a system in which we really thought about and invested in and had a more fair, balanced system where we worked with and encouraged individuals to get the support they needed, resolve the barriers for them, so that we get the property taxes paid and we keep those folks in their home. And that's a better legal system for all of us than what we have right now.
And I just want to add this point because I didn't get to it, but it goes to this idea of the tax sale being neutral. The tax sale may in fact be neutral, but the way property taxes are assessed in Baltimore City specifically is not exactly neutral, because folks in the Black Butterfly are taxed using a gross income calculation, which is not used anywhere else in the state of Maryland, I'm told. And it results in folks who have lower sales value paying 2.5 times roughly their sales value in assessments, or being assessed at 2.5 times their sales value versus those who have higher sales value. So the sale itself may be neutral, but how you even get to be in a position to be in the sale isn't neutral at all when you combine that and look at the tax rate itself, which everybody in the city, yes, pays. But the city is an economic engine for the rest of the state, yet the rest of the state isn't necessarily contributing to that in the ways that would make it equitable for everyone, and not have folks in the city paying, a ridiculous amount, having to have a ridiculous tax rate, which is a result of people leaving the city to live in the suburbs because of white flight, because of, redlining. All of those things, when you draw them back, they all come from the same root, and we have to address that root.
Thank you for interjecting that, Nika. That's really important. All right, our last question is open to, I'm asking to all of our panelists. And so in your opinion, where do we start to bring race equity into our civil legal system? Who are the key players that need to be a part of the conversation? If you could just share a few short sentences about your thoughts.
Amy, that's a really big question. I'll just kick it off is to say, I think first and foremost, we have to stop accepting that what we've done is fair and equitable and impartial. And we need to acknowledge in the civil legal system that we have set up a systems that benefit those in power. And we need to re-envision what a legal system really looks like that reflects our society and the non-equal places in which we get to start and move through the legal system. And we have to at least do what we're doing today, start having these conversations, start thinking about how we completely change how we're thinking about our legal system.
Nika, how about you?
Sure, I would say the first part is really, you can't, even though we understand that race is a social construct that really has no scientific bearing at all. Race may be made up, but racism is very real. And we have to dig very deeply and pull the threads to understand how racism shows up today and how it has impacted the legal system from today, working backwards into the past. And so at the end of it, you can't have equity. We hear a lot of talk from a lot of places about making sure we have equity. You cannot have equity without repair. And so in terms of the law really has to, civil law specifically in this case, has to look at how the law hasn't been race neutral, how it hasn't been accessible, and how it really was created and framed specifically to harm Black folks, to harm Indigenous people, to harm other peoples of color, and to put in place laws that repair that damage going forward. Because it's not enough to say, oh yeah, all right, cool, everybody, we equal today, but I don't have any arms and legs. And you have arms and you have arms and legs, and not you were born without them. You were born with them and I cut them off. right? So we have to be clear. You need to give people the prosthetics. You need to give people what is necessary for them to be able to achieve, for equity to be able to be achieved. And I think that's a key portion.
Yeah. Asia, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I think my thoughts echo that of Nika. Our legal system was built specifically with racial inequity embedded into it. Laws were created specifically to exclude Black people from various areas of law. In order to confront that ugly fact, we need to prioritize correcting the areas of law that are used to maintain power imbalances, such as housing law and tax sale. So that's my thoughts on it.
Hutch?
Yeah, I think, I think Susan and Nika and Asia have spoken eloquently about the systemic and structural change that needs to take place in the civil legal system to address these issues. And I want to come at it from the micro level, which is from the perspective of a volunteer, and to say that, you know, it is critical that people give of themselves and give of their own time to help those in need in the civil legal system, especially lawyers. We know the language, we know the processes. We are able to represent people who otherwise cannot navigate this process at all. And so it's incredibly important that we show up and show up big in order to help people through the process. And what I think a lot of lawyers don't realize is that in so doing, in Maryland especially, you are contributing to racial equity in the civil legal process by giving of yourself, by representing somebody who needs your help. It's one small step. We need a lot of small steps, but the more people that we have volunteering, giving of their time, representing others, the more we'll be able to make a real impact in the civil legal system here in Maryland.
So true. Yeah, I mean, there is really a dramatic power imbalance between individuals and corporations. And this is something that we really see, especially in the area of like debt collection and tenant laws that can prioritize property over and things over people. And an equitable system would guarantee the representation that Hutch is talking about, but it would provide that right to counsel, and it would be less punitive for issues that stem from poverty, including all the things that create the criminal laws the criminal records that we have to expunge, the licenses that we have to help people get, and the debt collection cases that we have to help them resolve. Margaret, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. So I want to give a big virtual round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your thoughts. We do have about 10 minutes left, so we do have some time for Q&A. So for our audience members, if you could please put any questions you have into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring that. And if you could also please share your media affiliation if you would like to do so. We are happy to spend our last couple minutes here answering any questions that that folks have. So I will kick it off with a question for our panelists. And we touched on this a bit, but I want to see if folks have anything to add. If in fact the laws are equally applied to everyone, why isn't our legal system racially equitable?
So let me try to tackle that really easy question. And then obviously happy to have others chime in. So we started this conversation by looking at the video that was part of our My Home, My Deed, My Legacy campaign. And that really came out of our understanding that we had a tremendous amount of what we think, or what we call legacy homeowners in Baltimore City, that they've passed homes down for generations, but were not taught or shared resources or knowledge or given the tools to do estate planning or estate administration. And so we have all of these individuals that are homeowners, but they're not the legal homeowners. And so at MVLS, we spend a lot of time working on this, and we're talking about Black homeowners who had to overcome, as we've already talked about, the Baltimore City official policy of discrimination to redlining and restrictive covenants and blockbusting, and up to current times in terms of subprime lending and not having access to credit in the same way that white people do. But, like I had a client, when you record a new deed, you have to current on your property tax, you have to pay $55 to the director of finance, and you have to pay $60 to the circuit court and land records. And again, that seems neutral. But when we work with our clients, and they're almost always Black homeowners in Baltimore City, those costs are tremendous barriers. And again, it's not because the communities of color need more financial education. They need more financial infusion. They need barriers reduced to employment and opportunities to create wealth. And so like I had a client who she couldn't get her water bill paid down, and she struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled and finally got her water bill paid down, but then she didn't have the $55 to record her new liens or her certificate so that we could record that deed. And it's like that $55. Most of us have family members or others that that they could come up with the $55. But when we work in communities that have been financially devastated, that $55 is a profoundly different kind of barrier than it is for other communities. And so that's, to me, always kind of like an example of what seems neutral, and then what is having a devastating impact on the communities of color that we work with.
Thanks, Susan. Does anyone else have any thoughts that they want to add to that? No, it is a big question. Okay, so we have a question from an audience member. This is Ethan from BBJ would like to know how responsive Director Raymond and the Finance Department have been to advocacy from MVLS and others for taking a more humane approach to the tax sale process. Nika, I know you've been involved in some of that. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the city has become accustomed to, for lack of a better term, eating its young. In that the city has become accustomed to putting the weight of maintenance of the city on Black homeowners, on Black laborers, on, Black people in general. And so now we are seeing, because there's, this whole dialogue about racial equity, we are starting to see that folks may be listening differently. I'm from Missouri, so you have to show me. I will believe it when I see specific policy changes, when we're collecting our unpaid property taxes differently. But there's definitely some signaling that folks are at least listening different. But I have a difficult time believing that, given the nature of what we can plainly see in front of our face, that people have not known for a long time who this was disproportionately impacting, and how the impact was disproportionate. So, it's show and tell time. So we shall see.
I just want to add into that, I want to echo everything that Nikki just said, but I want to also add in that, the Department of Finance is really held up that the interest rate that gets charged the interest rate that gets charged for property taxes after somebody has gone to tax sale. This is 12% for owner-occupied properties and 18% for non-owner occupied properties. We know that plenty of properties get miscategorized so that they actually are owner-occupied, but they're marked as non-owner occupied. This is a separate problem. But the Department of Finance has said that it's important that these interest rates be offered because they want to ensure that tax sale purchasers are going to want to purchase people's homes at tax sale. And that is a really perverse incentive to me. That's something that I don't relish seeing.
Okay, our next question is from Sean Yos at the Afro newspaper. And this question is, what role does municipal benevolence play in the pursuit of equity? For example, Mosby isn't prosecuting some lower level crimes. How can City Hall in an intentional way signal to residents that the city is not an enemy? So I'll I read that to be kind of like, what concrete steps can the city take in that direction? But I'll let other people comment on any thoughts that they have.
I would say that the way that the city can show residents that the city doesn't perceive residents are the enemy, because I think that was what I understood the question to be. So if we're talking specifically about racial equity and land, in the larger discussion about civil law, Dr. Lawrence Brown did excellent work defining the Baltimore Neighborhood Reparations Fund and Social Equity. Those are things that the city could look in. Those are tools that the city could look into developing to address some of these issues. Something as simple as reforming the adopt-a-lot or side lot programs so that folks in community aren't doing what I call civic sharecropping, which is taking care of the city's property and not having an ownership stake in them, or being, getting an ownership stake in the property through a side lot program, but not being able to build on the lot for 10 years when you know that somebody purchasing it is 70 years old and the average life expectancy is 75. So some of these things, there's some simple steps that the city can take, but they have to be taking steps that benefit the people, not developers, not tax certificate purchasers, and certainly not, one of the reasons why the city is so pressed on this tax sale is because Director Raymond was quoted in the Sun saying the city needs money. Well, the city has to stop putting a couple dollars today over the needs of tomorrow over the needs of the people today. And given that we have $700 million worth of federal funding coming into the city, that funding being the lion's share of that funding being distributed to the very communities that we're talking about being represented in these civil cases by MVLS, that money going to specifically to investment in those communities to address many of the issues that we've been talking about would be more, because we're not looking for signals, we're looking for actual outcomes. No more optics, we're looking for actual outcomes. So that's what the city could do.
That is so true. And I think even if we just think about the example in the question about not prosecuting certain low-level offenses, it's not just not prosecuting those low-level offenses, but it has to go bigger than that, because there are all of these folks that still have charges on their records that are even ones that were not entered against them, but are still expungible charges. That there is a process that Hutch has been involved in for numerous clients to help file these expungements. That shouldn't necessarily be a process that these folks need to take in order to get themselves out from under the burden of those charges that have been previously leveled against them. There's obviously a new process for people going forward, but there are all of these people that have been so negatively impacted by the system that we're not going to see enough of a benefit for, especially for the people that are still under this oppressive weight.
I would throw out just, I think this relates to the question, but Baltimore did, of course, pass the right to counsel in eviction legislation at the end of last year, which does grant tenants the right to counsel in eviction proceedings, which is a step in the right direction in this area. I mean, I think it was statistics are something like 96% of landlords are represented in eviction proceedings. 1% of tenants are are represented. And so having a lawyer in that process is definitely a step in the right direction. It has a significant racial impact. I think there was a study done by Berkeley that let's see here, that the number of Black women evicted in Baltimore City is 3.9 times higher than the number of white men. It's 296% more. So there is a significant impact in having a right to counsel in eviction proceedings.
And if I could just add one more thing to that, I mean, certainly tax sales a forefront model in terms of like what the city could be doing differently. Margaret had mentioned early on that both Nika and I were on the mayor's steering committee, the transition committee, and I'm assuming Nika heard the same thing that I heard over and over and over, which is we need the city to stop just immediately getting to no and thinking about how to get to yes. So actually, instead of just continuing to follow systems that don't work well for the city itself, let alone for its residents, and that disproportionate negative impact, particularly on communities of color, instead of following this failed problematic system and just defaulting to that, what if we ask that next question of, is this the right way to do it? Who is it going to impact? We had there's a tax sale benefit hopefully rolling out in the next month or so for future tax sales, which hopefully at some point we won't have tax sales anymore in the way we have them now. But when we first heard about the details of it, we immediately started flagging, well, this is how the folks that actually really need help are going to be left out. Like these conversations need to be happening with communities, the folks that are in the communities, with advocates, like to really think through this policy on its face, again, that seems neutral, and then how that's actually going to impact the individuals that are going to, be living that experience. And so that's the other thing I would say is that the city needs to stop leaning towards just getting to know and actually engaging in conversations with individuals in those communities and supporting those communities about what these actual policies and practices, what they're going to actually do in reality.
Well, thank you. We are at time, actually. So I want to thank all of our panelists so much for being with us today and for engaging us in this candid conversation about racial disparities and the legal system. And I also want to thank our attendees for joining us today and want to offer that, we are here, we're happy to talk about these issues and be a resource. So please feel free to reach out to us now or in the future. You'll also get a really quick survey when you leave this webinar. And if you have other questions for us, we would love your questions or feedback. But I just wanted to, again, thank everybody so much for being a part of our presentation today. And we appreciate your time. Thank you.